Uh, this is a meeting of the Sam and Esther Dolgoff Institute. Today we will be discussing the life and times of Johann Most with Tom Goyens, who has written a upcoming biography or soon to be published biography of Johann Most and his importance to the anarchist movement in the United States. Here's a picture of Mr. Most taken from his good side. He was had a disease in his jaw when he was a young man, which caused a deformity, which is why he grew a beard, I take it.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I will turn the meeting over to Tom.
Tell everybody to turn their...
And everybody can turn their audio off, and we'll let Tom speak for a while, and then he'll open the floor to questions. So, Tom, take it away.
All right. So, first of all, everyone can hear me okay? No muffled sounds or anything? Well, thank you, Jeff. This is very exciting. Thanks for inviting me and all of you attending. There's a lot of names I sort of know, but never put a face to it. So thanks for attending. I thought I would, what I don't want to do is just do a summary of his life in 25 minutes or something like that. So I thought I would kind of talk about several aspects, highlighting certain aspects of his life, maybe talk about some challenges that I encountered, and also something about why is Most such a neglected figure. I think that needs some explanation. Not that I have the end all and be all answers to all of it, but my biography, which is coming out in September, University of Illinois Press, it will be the first scholarly biography in English about Most, and Most died in 1906. There have been writings about Most, but nothing really that sort of unifies the whole thing. I have a little bit more on that in a minute. I guess what I want to do, I assume everybody's heard of Johann Most or John Most. He changed his name. Maybe you've heard of him as an advocate of anarchist terrorism, as a companion and later rival of Emma Goldman. If you haven't heard of Most, I can tell you that you've probably heard of him indirectly. And that would be through the typical cartoon caricature of an anarchist. I don't know if you can picture it, but it's usually some kind of lunatic figure, crazed, bearded, wild-eyed, with spiky hair, like a bomb or tucked away somewhere. That image was really assembled by cartoonists from the real person of Johann Most, who actually did have a beard, as you could see, spiky hair, and he had that crooked face, which I can talk about more later. So this caricature, I think, is sort of an interesting sort of way into Most, because this really became a meme on social media. Social media back then was basically print media, but it had that kind of staying power. And so, who is the real Johann Most? So that's sort of what I was setting out to do. So the first thing I want, before I say anything else, the first thing I want to do is give you sort of a basic timeline. And I know maybe you're already aware of this, but it's kind of crucial for the rest of what I'm going to talk about. This is sort of a bird's eye view of his entire life. Most lived in Europe for 36 years, and he lived in the US for 23 years. So he was 36 years old when he arrived in the US, and he died at age 60. So just sort of keep that in mind. If we just take his adult political life, he was a socialist or social democrat for 13 years, and he was an anarchist for 23 years. There's sort of a transition period in between, but so you can kind of, I don't want to lose you, but just keep in mind that basically his US period coincides with his anarchist period, if that makes sense. Basically from 1883 to 1906. So the reason I'm laying this out like this is that when I first started sort of gathering information, I found German and Austrian historians mostly writing about most European years and US writers covering his US years. And that there's nothing wrong with that, but it sort of produced a very bifurcated picture, if that makes sense, right? So if as a read or somebody interested in the anarchist movement, you would read one or the other, but there was no, like, how did one become the other, right? So it sounds obvious, but it was a bit of a challenge to produce this biography to unify his story, right? And so, because of course he's the same person, and so how did this happen that he actually changes his political ideology a few times, which is, I think, a very interesting aspect. So what I'm saying is, in this bird's eye view, Most is a complex figure. He's a transnational figure. You could sort of see his life as a journey through geographical and ideological landscapes, if that makes sense, right? So and each time he adapts and sort of evolves his political views depending on what is possible in that space and time. So the biography is an attempt to put Most on the map, right, of radical history, and kind of explaining, or at least giving context to the many changes he went through, which is something you don't get in the present literature. I would argue it's very hard. Like, there are certain stereotypes that have sort of stayed on. So that was my first sort of bird's eye view, if that makes sense. So I want to go a little deeper and give you a few aspects that I think are reasons why Most is a significant figure and deserves a biography. So I'm going to try to be disciplined to just list these, but each of these are certainly worth a whole discussion, and hopefully it will sort of inspire some questions for later. Okay, so first of all, I would argue that you cannot understand well the early socialist movements in Austria and Germany without understanding Most. So I'm not saying he is the largest figure in these movements, but he was certainly very significant and consequential. Both Austria and Germany. I would also argue that you can't understand the early US anarchist movement, and I'm talking here 1880s, 1890s, without really understanding Most. So, and obviously I work this out in much greater detail. One example is that's probably familiar to many of you is that Most helped quite explicitly the careers of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, even though he had a falling out with both. And I would argue that those three figures, they had this sort of personal dimension, but they are absolutely crucial for the history of American anarchism. I'm probably saying things you already know, but Most helped Goldman's speaking career. Berkman worked for the Freiheit, which is the newspaper that Most edited. So that's sort of an important aspect. So what I'm saying is it's not just that Most is important in the United States. There is much more research in the last 20 years or so of Most in Austria and Germany, but by Austrian and German historians. Okay, another aspect. And so other scholars may see things differently. This is really what struck me, is Most's unwavering dedication to his cause. It's really remarkable, I think. Whatever you think of his cause or of his tactics, the sheer perseverance and work ethic in the face of repression and ridicule, frankly. So many people commented on this, friends and foes. He's one of these people, if you were sort of, friends with him, it's one of these people you would say, man, this guy, you got to give it to him. He just keeps going. And I think it's quite remarkable. To give some little context here, he spent 9 years in total in prison. So not in one stint, right? But I just added all the prison terms. This is in Austria, Germany, England, U.S., and every time he just picks up where he left off, and he would use his prison times. He called it his universities. He would read. He was a sort of autodidact, right? So that is something that really struck me. I don't know if it's inspiring, but I think it could be relevant even for today's activists. Okay, another aspect is the fact that he never, for all his revolutionary fervor, he never neglected the aesthetic and artistic dimensions of life. I think many of you probably know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of, there's sort of this old ideal of the revolutionary, uncompromising, and it's often a sacrifice that people make consciously. Most he always he loved theater. That's, you probably know this, but since his boyhood, he was a theater lover, and he loved poetry, and he loved playing chess, and he loved hiking in nature, and he wanted, it's this old saying, it was about bread but roses too, right? That famous saying that I think it was a poem at some point. I think this is quite relevant even for today. It definitely rubbed off on Emma Goldman, who, as you probably know, wrote a lot about literature and drama, and maybe Berkman not so much. Berkman often criticized Most for going to the bourgeois theater, right? Okay, so and there's so much more to say here. Most also, he created his own theater company in New York. So, all right. So that I think that's an important aspect. Another is Most's just extraordinary mastery of the written and spoken German language. Especially if you know, if you're a little, if you have some knowledge of German, it's quite remarkable how he could communicate. And I know most people understand that he was a great orator, but he was actually a great writer too, a great editor. I see some comparisons with Luigi Galliani sometimes. You have to take it, you can't do this too uncritically, but both were fabulous speakers and communicators. And if I may, an aside here, if I may make a shameless plug here, I'm working on and almost finished with a anthology of Most's anarchist writings in English for AK Press. And it's been a challenge to translate because he just invents words, and so the style is quite unique. I already mentioned Freiheit. I kind of want to stress this. You really can't understand Most in America without knowing his attachment to Freiheit. He called it his daughter. This is still one of the longest running anarchist periodicals. I mean, it's not running now, but 31 years. That's quite an accomplishment. Okay, another aspect. This is something probably not everybody would agree on, but I think it's really important, is his devastating critique of religion, superstition, and the clergy. I find it really remarkable how he had all these arguments that you now see with sort of the new atheists. Probably some of you are familiar with one of his most widely read pamphlets called The God Pestilence, or Die Gottespest. Translated in dozens of languages. It's quite good. I personally think it is often neglected by historians of radicalism, this critique of religion. Most was an atheist before he was a socialist, and it really influenced his entire political career. I would also mention Most's commentary on American politics and American society. Again, I have many articles translated. It's quite fascinating. It's funny how he describes American political corruption, something that some of you may know, the whole idea of American exceptionalism. He's very good at that. I'm looking at the time here. I think I kind of wanted to say a few more things, if that's okay. I wanted to. I anticipate, when this book comes out, that people will be discussing anarchist violence, which is a legitimate topic, and it always comes up with figures like Most and Berkman and Galliani. Um, I kind of speak as a historian here. What I want to do is basically report the truth, right, and be objective and give context. So I can say a few things about this. Most never committed a violent crime. Not that I know of. He certainly was convicted of other things, inciting the riot, for example, and some of these charges I think are somewhat questionable. But Most did advocate anarchist terrorism in the service of the cause. But, and this is maybe something not everybody knows, he only did this for about 4 years, maybe 4.5. From 1882 to, let's say, 1886-7, which is, as you know, the Haymarket Affair, which was really a turning point. So just to put this in perspective, he advocated insurrectionism, anarchist terrorism, for 4 years out of 39 of his political life. And what did this look like? I mean, he firmly believed that the end justifies the means. For those 4 years, he supported individual acts of violence, including arson and assassination. He was inspired by the Russian revolutionary terrorists. And of course, he saw class war as an asymmetrical confrontation and therefore urged revolutionaries to use new technologies like dynamite. But he did abandon this. Let's say by 1887, he's quite clear about this. He abandons individual propaganda by the deed, right, as it was called, the notion of offensive violence. But he retained, this is a sort of subtle differences here, he retained support for the right to self-defense. It's interesting, he does write about the Second Amendment a few times. He also supported, and I'm deliberately a bit facetious here, but the idea of collective preparedness, which was a term used, of course, in the Wilson years, preparedness, but he wrote several essays on the benefits of arming the proletariat. And again, saying in America this is possible because we have the Second Amendment. He grows a little less enthusiastic about that after 1890 or so. So there's some subtleties here. I want to make that clear. Maybe some other, I feel the need to give some context here as a historian. I personally think it's an absolute mistake to advocate for this kind of violence. But that is just a personal view. I am trying to understand where Most is coming from. So there is a certain empathy, I think, required of a historian. So the context here, I think, is important. And I spent some time in the book about this. And this has to do, this will be familiar to many of you, the whole debate on the monopoly of violence. But I would also add the monopoly of naming things violent, if that makes sense. Who gets to say when something is terror or is violent, right? And when Most arrived in the United States, violence in the United States was, and this might become somewhat controversial, but I think, speaking as a historian, was rather commonplace. The famous historian Richard Hofstadter has, that's kind of what he wrote this big book on violence in America, and violence was sort of embedded in the culture. it was different than in Europe. In Europe, violence was really monopolized by the state, right? There was the military and the police, and there was a lot of secret police. In the US, it was sort of everywhere. It was diffuse. And Most understood this. He saw this. There was corporate violence. There was industrial violence. The industrial capitalism Most saw as a violent system that had to be met with violence. This is not to justify anything. It's just a context. The historian Beverly Gage has written that American industry killed an estimated 35,000 workers in accidents each year at the end of the century. So, and there is another historian, I know this is very specific, but it kind of illustrates the point. Some of you may know Robert Hunter. He was a progressive journalist, I believe, who wrote in 1914 that the entire history of terror in the US probably begins with Johann Most. Now, Johann Most did advocate, like I said, for 4 years, anarchist terrorism. But what's so striking to me is that Robert Hunter entirely ignores the brutality of Southern racial violence, for example. The Klan was a terrorist group, right, founded in the wake of the Civil War. So, again, it's just simply kind of providing this kind of context in which we talk about anarchist violence. Okay, let me, if I may, I have a few final remarks here. So I've been making a case, hopefully, of why Most is an important figure. It's consequential in many sort of histories of socialism and anarchism. So why has he been so neglected, right? So that even though the book is done, I still sometimes think about this. It's the best I can come up with is something what I maybe want to call, like, Most was sort of a victim of double prejudice. So what I mean by this, there is, I think still is in some areas, a prejudice against Most for being a socialist in Germany and a prejudice for being an anarchist in America. So what I mean by this is, since in researching this book, I had to familiarize myself with the literature, and I found that historians of German socialism, this is an enormous, body of work, and there are exceptions, but many of them, especially in the 20th century, have silenced and misrepresented Most quite deliberately. And why would that be? Well, because the big names of early German socialism, I'm now talking about actual socialists like Marx and Engels, like Bernstein and a few other, they belittled him, even though he was among the most significant activists. And there's many reasons for this, which we can go into. But so you have this dynamic where the historians who came later kind of parroted these big names that were held in reverence about Most. And the weird thing, or maybe it's not weird, but the fact that Most abandoned social democracy, he was actually expelled from the party, added to Most as the black sheep, right? And so, yeah, look, he's an anarchist now. He was never really a socialist anyway. So he comes to the United States, converts to anarchism, but in Germany, the sort of misrepresentation begins, right? So in the United States, he also suffers from this kind of maybe not as deliberate, but Most is only the firebrand of terrorism, and that's all he does, and he's kind of a joke. I think what's added to this is that Most almost or very rarely wrote and spoke in English. He sometimes did, but he didn't like it. He only said it when some of the comrades said, can you please do it in English? And like, all right. But he wanted to speak in German. And so what the American public knew of Most, they read in newspapers. The New York Police Department had several German agents or officers who'd sort of translated, but we never know was it really the right translation and so forth. So, in some ways, Most, by making that choice, sort of ensured that he was not fully understood. I think. Now, several pamphlets were translated in English, but I think, the bulk of his work is in German. And then even if you could read German, most of the articles in Freiheit and even the pamphlets were printed in the Gothic script, which can also be a burden. Maybe another reason is that Most, who did write his memoirs, but he never finished the chapters on his US years. Unlike Goldman and Berkman, who wrote memoirs in English and very detailed. So maybe that's another reason why Most was sort of neglected. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to the Q&A, but I also think just the march of time, we have the Progressive Era and especially the World War I period, which was devastating for the American left, as many of you probably know. So in the competition for media space or attention, Most was simply forgotten in a way. So we have, around the World War I, we have the IWW, we have Big Bill Haywood, we have the Gallianisti, right, with their often violent campaigns. We have the Russian radicals, we have the Palmer raids. Goldman and Berkman are deported, right? So they leave the U.S. scene. We have Sacco and Vanzetti. I think Most sort of became this kind of quaint memory of the Gilded Age, maybe, perhaps. So those are sort of my suggestions of why Most has sort of been neglected. And hopefully my book will change a little bit of that. So I don't know if that's I think I want to stop here because I love the Q&A. So thank you for listening.
That was very good. Thank you, Tom. Do people want to start raising their hands or whatever so we can Ian has raised his hand. Ian, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thanks very much. That was very interesting. I have a very specific question, which is basically, which might sound strange, but you mentioned that you thought that the anarchist period for Most was about 1883 onwards. But if you read, for example, the Beast of Property and the sort of his discussion of the revolution, he talks about like executive committees. He talks about like revolutionary committees will be constituted. These execute the decrees of the Revolutionary Army. Now rule like a new conqueror of the world. He talks about massacres of the people's enemies must be instituted and so forth. none of which is remotely anarchist. It is very much in favour, similar to what he was writing before he arrived in America, which was more sort of, standard social democratic, even Blanquist notion of a sort of resolute minority seizing power and then sort of forcing people to be free. And even sort of Max Netto in his obituary in 1906 in Freedom suggested that it was like uncouth state socialism or federalist socialism that Most was advocating around 1883, and that he only became an anarchist, a proper anarchist, after the Haymarket event, which would fall in with his rejection of propaganda by deed. I just wondered what you thought about that, because reading what little there is, and sort of you seem to have you've got an anarchist communist analysis of capitalism in, say, the Pittsburgh's Declaration. You've got a federalist, socialist, libertarian notion of what the theory of society would be like, but that's combined with a sort of a Blanquist vision of the actual revolution itself. And I think sort of what I've read subsequent to the 1887 period is more consistent with anarchist theory in terms of what a revolution would be like. So I just wondered, in what you've read, does that ring a bell? Does that sound like he sort of was a process by which he became an anarchist in the early years in America? He wasn't quite one. Pure in terms of transition, obviously his analysis of what's wrong and what it should be like is obviously like libertarian collectivist. But the strategy, how the actual revolutionary strategy is like, you read it and you go like, God, that's horrific. So, that's just, what is he on? And so I just wondered what your opinion on that, but, do you see an evolution? Do you see a marked change? Are the early years significantly different from, the post-87 period?
Yeah. So yes, there is. So I guess I'll sort of restate the question maybe a little bit for everyone. Like you're wondering if there's sort of a ideological evolution, maybe various stages, where Most sort of abandoned social democracy, but then sort of becomes an anarchist, but with all this other baggage. Yes. I think you're right about that. Yes. So what's interesting about Most is that is his period in London, which I haven't really mentioned a lot about, but that's sort of this transitional period where he is expelled from the Social Democratic Party and is in this kind of limbo. So I'll go through the timeline, but sort of rather quickly. But so he is detached from Germany, right? So he used to be a member of parliament. So he's detached from his constituents, social democrat. Slowly he jettisons the idea of parliament, of parliamentarism. So, okay. So, but there's still this idea of the people's state, right? This was the part of the social democracy. That now gets withered away. And he doesn't really know, like, okay, the state maybe not, but I don't know. He's very focused on tactics. So what is left really is this word social, right? Social democracy, that falls away. Now it's social revolutionary. So then he is inspired by the Russians. They just know how to do this, and it's all about tactics. In London, he meets actual anarchists, like Victor Dave, which is a Belgian Bakuninist. So then he gets that idea. Okay, maybe the state, I should be more clear, reject the state at all. And there's some, we have some communal things and collectivist organization, but he's still focused on tactics. He also takes in a lot of Blanqui. I don't know if that's a familiar name. Blanqui was this sort of revolutionary, and he wanted these vanguard groups, and it's all in there. So then he moves to the United States, and you see the first time that he is called an anarchist by others. And in the US, he absorbs more and more Bakunin. So it's true that when you read some of his works in those early 80s, there's terrible stuff in there about indiscriminate violence. But next to it, like the previous chapter in the book, he has this famous pamphlet called the Freie Gesellschaft, the Free Society. The previous chapter is all Bakunin. It's about, like a collective ownership, and you do your work and you keep track of time and things like that. So I would say from 1883 that, yes, I think he was an anarchist in the sense that he had this kind of loose Bakuninism. But you're right, plus all this other baggage of insurrectionism, which you can also tie to Bakunin a little bit. So what you're referring to, the post-87, so the evolution continues, he jettisons all this insurrectionism and propaganda by the deed, and by 1890, he is fully embracing communist anarchism. He publishes works by Kropotkin, by Domela Nieuwenhuis, and maybe that's where you're seeing, oh, that's more like it. That feels more like proper anarchism. I don't know if that answers, but I would say the early 80s in America, there is definitely a Bakuninism there.
Okay, Maria had her hand up, and then John. Maria?
Oh, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, you are muted. Maria, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, got it. So yeah, thanks so much for this. Really fascinating. I was, I think I may have my years wrong, but I read recently about Emma Goldman and Berkman being inspired by Most, and but when Berkman attempted to assassinate Frick, that Most was really extremely critical, and Emma went after him, and I don't know. Was that before he gave up the support of violence, or after? I'm not sure. I just wanted to find out a little about that.
Yeah. That was after, and that's a really important insight. This is a story that always comes up whenever I talk about early American anarchism. So the Frick assassination attempt was that is later, 1892. With so by that time, Most had for years already abandoned, especially the form of propaganda by deed that focuses on individual acts to spark a revolution, right? So this idea, it sort of goes back to these Russians, and you could almost argue you see it a little bit with John Brown, right? This idea like we're going to do this one thing, and then so he has already abandoned that, and he's written about it several times. So I have certainly sort of some views on this. So when Emma Goldman is is basically just kind of amazed that, like, why are you so against Berkman? There are some subtleties here. Most at some point, he's definitely like, this was a stupid thing. This is going to set back the anarchist movement. They're going to, he's arrested, and look, they're going to have a field day. He's an immigrant. He's a Jew. He's like, oh, this is terrible. But Most also suggested a little bit that maybe, this was kind of like Berkman just did it for himself. He wanted, this is what Goldman really disliked. However, when Goldman says, what gives? I thought you were all for this. This is what I believed. And that's disingenuous, because she knew that Most had already abandoned this. Most was certainly in favor of what happened at Homestead when the workers pushed back the Pinkertons. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, but there was a whole battle. Most immediately went to his office and churned out an article like this. I think it was called "This Is How It's Done." So he liked that, but this guy from Russia, from New York, going there and thinking now the workers are this is all wrong. So I think this was disingenuous for Goldman to say, you're just untrue to yourself. No, he was already had abandoned that idea.
Okay, John.
There we are. Okay, sorry. I had two questions that go in rather different directions. First, I was reminded, and I've thought this, for a while, but Bakunin, of course, writes about how when you enter parliament, even if you're the most revolutionary worker, you become bourgeois, that the institutional material conditions of being in government force you that way. And I had an argument once with a Trotskyist who insisted that philosophically Bakunin was wrong, but conceded that in every case he was aware of, Bakunin had been proved right in practice. But Most, who he wasn't aware of, seems to go in a different direction than that. And I'm sort of curious about why so many alleged revolutionaries fall into this statist way of thinking and Most escapes it. Radically different direction. I just reviewed a book which in its chapter on the German immigrant press has a paragraph on Most. It's kind of odd. It has a paragraph. The introduction has 3 times as much space talking about the importance of its discussion of Most. So I think the editors thought that Most was more important than the author did. But nonetheless, in the course of that, it cites a police agent claiming that roughly 90% of the Freiheit circulation is going back into Germany, which I'm certain isn't true. I'm certain the raw numbers they give, I made up the percent. I calculated it from the police agent's claim of how many copies are printed and how many are going to Germany. I'm certain that the number of copies is wrong. I'm certain that the 90% is wrong, but I am curious at the extent to which Freiheit does continue to circulate in or influence events back in Germany.
So the history of Freiheit is fascinating because it's founded in London, and from the start, the problem. So there was a German diaspora in England, and so he could have all those subscribers, but they wanted more. So there was a German diaspora in Paris, in Brussels, in Switzerland. So quickly, the major issue becomes, how do we get this physical newspaper into Germany and Austria? And they have banned this. They banned everything that Most published. So once Most moves to the United States, he leaves. There is a I don't know if I want to use this word, but it's just like a cadre, but I don't mean this in the, the kind of Leninist way, but a group of people, maybe a handful of trusted people who keep the smuggling operation going. So what you have is in New York, in the early, let's say 83 to 80, probably 86, 87, it is true that Most produced two versions of Freiheit. And I don't think it's 90%, but a good amount. At first, the majority were printed in New York and then shipped to London. And then from there, through all kinds of ingenious ways, smuggled into Germany. Sometimes literally by persons. I don't know if they had backpacks or something, but they would walk across the border. Belgium was a favorite place because it's kind of a wooded area there, and you could just walk and then deliver. It's like this, it's almost like this narco kind of thing where they smuggle in this stuff. So, and there's more to say about that. But yes, in the early years when Most is in the US, a good amount of Freiheit goes to Europe and makes it into the hands of German and Austrian subscribers. Now, it is very hard to gauge how many and what kind of an impact. I mean, anarchism was never very strong in Germany. What strength it kept, I think Freiheit was the reason why. Now, there were also European newspapers that made it into Germany, but the German police was actually quite good. I did research quite a long time in the Prussian police archives, which is a fascinating place. It's all open. There are boxes all labeled with a person's name. And the whole idea is, this is 19th century. There's no secret police in the US, right? There's no FBI until, 1908, I think, the Bureau of Investigation. So the German police was tracking all of this. And I know from internal documents that they said, look, don't destroy the whole network. Just leave a few people because we want to keep track of what's happening with the socialists and anarchists. So at some point, though, Most gets so frustrated with people in London and in Germany who get the Freiheit not paying. They're just not paying their subscription money. And at some point, and I forgot when it is, but it's like the mid 1880s, he's like, screw this whole European thing. I'm halving the number of Freiheits I go to Europe. I'm going to concentrate on America. And you see this in the coverage. He writes a lot more about American politics and so forth. So, but you're right. The first years he's in America, his vision, his focus is Europe. He's just in America where he's safe. He has freedom of the press. Let's continue propagandizing in Europe remotely, so to speak, right? But after a while, he's just there's a lot of rivalry, and he's like, screw it. The Londoners can do their own thing. I'm doing an American anarchist paper in German. Yeah, Louis.
Yeah. Thanks. I have two questions. One is, it seems according to your timeline that Most really began to focus on anarchism when he came to the United States. I'm wondering if something about the culture of the United States, or what was it about the United States, if there was anything particular about the United States that persuaded him to change. And the other question has to do with what you are considering, and when you talk about Most being a neglected figure, and I'm wondering if the strain of violence in his rhetoric and its application in the beginning of the 21st century is cogent here, and the nature. And you were talking quite well before about the difference between the European perspective on violence, state-oriented and corporate and stuff, and how it's different in the United States. And I'm wondering if that plays any part in how we look at Most. Thanks.
Yeah, great questions. So I Most is so this kind of goes back to what I think Ian was asked. There, you could make a case in some way that Most was a bit late to the game of solid philosophical anarchism, and there's different strands here. He really gets more introduced to anarchism in London already. Mostly the ideas of Bakunin, but Bakunin is long dead, right? And he dies in 76, I think. So, but there are people that he meets in London who tell him about. Most is really not. He never really heard about anarchism that much in Germany. I think that's because the Socialist Party was actually quite strong, and they kind of put a wall up. And it's sort of in London where he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And he gets all these ideas. Blanqui, there is a French guy, Edouard Vaillant, who was from the Commune, and the Russians. And it's all focused on tactics and how do we actually get things done. And so in all this talk, there is a little bit of anarchist philosophy, mostly Bakunin. So he's already, when he comes to the US, he's already kind of knows about it a little bit, but he's not well versed in it. I think that is fair to say. And he keeps, and all his time is taken up by Freiheit. This is his thing. And he doesn't want any rivals. He doesn't want any joint editorship. He wants to bring down the two worst autocratic regimes in Europe, Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. That's his focus. And it's all about how do we do this? And Freiheit is a way. And when he's in New York, that's still his focus. So it's only a bit later. So I want to say he's kind of technically an anarchist. He certainly calls himself an anarchist, and he writes about Bakunin's ideas in his writings in the early 80s. But later on, and especially in the 1890s, when you read his more philosophical things, he actually writes, man, I wish I was kind of wrong before. Now I see the light. I've been reading Kropotkin more, whereas Kropotkin was well read before that. But so he's a bit later, and I'm not saying communist anarchism is the end all be all, but so it's a slower process. But what I find fascinating is that he kind of embraces it. He has an essay somewhere in the 1890s, and it starts where he regrets that anarchism has become such a caricature of a guy with a knife and a bomb. And you read this and I'm like, dude, this you created half of this. Right? That's you, but he's wrestling. He's probably not somebody who really is good at admitting, but he revises a lot, and I think that's a thread. And he becomes interested in syndicalism later, and so forth. I'm sorry. I think there was a second question attached to that. I forgot what it was.
It was about.
Was it about the American
the violence of his thinking and why that changed, and is there a relationship between his thinking along those lines of being the voice of terror, as another biographer referred to him as, and his being being neglected historically?
I think the answer is yes, and especially through the power of, again, I'm using contemporary words, but the power of memes and social media. Now, you got to translate this to late 19th century, but these cartoons keep coming up. Even after he's dead, when the American public sees this, they may not know Johann Most, but they see this crazed, wild-eyed, disheveled little lunatic figure. So in some ways, Most blackened the name of anarchism somewhat. I think that is true. His explosives manual was certainly a piece of evidence during the Haymarket trial. Again, I think the later iterations, and I keep coming back to Luigi Galliani, who also wrote an explosives manual, is probably better known because there are all these connections with Sacco Vanzetti, with the Wall Street bombing, which was a horrific terror attack. So yes, I think the short answer is yes, and indirectly, he can whine about it all he wants later on. Look, I'm no longer thinking this, and I'm squarely in the camp of Kropotkin and Domela Nieuwenhuis, and even syndicalism seems interesting. But yeah, perhaps the damage was done. And I think that's why probably, his later writings, even if you wanted to say, look, I'm sure this guy didn't think this all his life, let me read a little bit other things. It's hard to find. So my anthology hopefully will open that up, that space where his other writings are quite, I think, quite fascinating and not at all about terrorism.
Well, perhaps there's a bit of a double standard here with violence being advocated by right-wing sources or the ruling class or whatever, which seems to just fly under the radar, whereas anything that was said by anarchists was assumed to be representative of all anarchists. Shelby Shapiro had his hand up earlier, and then Ian wanted to say something.
No, I'll pass it on to Ian.
Hey, Ian?
Bennett Till has had his hand up.
I just was thinking of so many of his contemporaries. They were either his contemporaries or they came after. I don't have the dates of all these people, but it would be interesting to know what his relationship was with them. People like Gustav Landauer, a great German anarchist was assassinated, of course, we know. Rucker, he was in London at more or less the same time, am I right? Louisa Michel, you talk about the other one, the Malatesta. Then we had the Congas who shot McKinley. That would have been right up his alley.
Mm-hmm.
Parsons, Lucy Parsons. I don't have a specific question as to this one, but if you have, you could expound maybe on how he got along with his contemporaries. Would be interesting.
Yeah, I think Rucker arrived in London when Most was already in New York. I can't remember the exact date now. Is it early 1890s? I think. There is a. I have not found any direct correspondence between Most and Rucker. Actually, I think not. But there are some interesting correlations here. Of course, Rucker. I saw a question, but so Rucker, yes, Rucker wrote a biography. In fact, I would say probably one of the first serious biographies in any language of Most in 1924. Both were, of course, Germans, and both were bookbinders, and
some kind of
yeah, and they both worked within or close to the Jewish radical movement. I think Most mentions Landauer when he was very young. Landauer was part of the Jungen, the young socialists. I think generally in a positive light, Most admired Malatesta. He did not like Czolgosz. Most condemned the assassination of McKinley. He was quick to say, "We don't know this guy," and so forth. So he not constantly, but several times in the period after 87, right? He writes about those kinds of tactics not suitable for the United States. This is not how we should proceed. He has some interesting ways of talking about radicalism as an immigrant story. We need to expand English language propaganda, only propaganda by the word. So he didn't like the McKinley, and of course he sort of got implicated a little bit because he had printed this story. And he served a year in prison, which was it's a very questionable trial, I think. I'm not a lawyer, but I think somebody could have a nice little essay on that. I forgot. Oh, Louise Michel, he absolutely admired her. I think at some point she was slated to visit the United States, but couldn't come or something like that, and that everyone was very disappointed. So yeah.
Ian, did you want to say something or ask a question, and then after Ian, Shelby again thought of a new one?
Yeah, just out of interest, it's just sort of a general point. I remember, I think I read once where Most says something along the lines of, I'm a socialist. In terms of goals, I follow Marx, but in terms of tactics, I follow Bakunin. And obviously, Bakunin didn't advocate propaganda by the deed. It developed after he died. If you read, sort of the account of the 1881 London Congress, which obviously Most didn't attend because he was in prison. But if you read the account in Kropotkin's Revolt, it's a very different picture. Emerges than the standard one where it's all like, let's blow stuff up and dynamite is great. It's far more nuanced than that. And there's very little of that in the report in Kropotkin's paper. And you mentioned the Russian populists. Is that the main source of the so-called anarchist tactic or propaganda by the deed, because Kropotkin didn't embrace it, Bakunin didn't embrace it. In terms of the French anarchist movement, there's obviously the Social Revolution, the paper funded by the police, which seems to be sort of the main source of all this sort of nonsense. But I just wondered, where did they get the notion that propaganda by the deed was an anarchist tactic when nobody really embraced that? It's not to be found in Kropotkin's paper, and nowhere to be found in Bakunin. So I just wondered, is it purely the Russian populace he gets it from, and he sort of generalizes it from it, or does he take the sort of Marx and Engels and the social democratic nonsense written to discredit anarchism, and does he take that as sort of the gospel and assumes it's true? So where does he get this notion from? Is it purely the Russian populace, or is it sort of a sort of wider current he feeds into, which I'm not aware of?
Yeah, I think so. So one thing to say, so propaganda by the deed has a history that kind of goes back to some of the Italian revolutionaries like Cafiero. Paul Bruce is another person. I think they're sort of early anarchists. Now, I think at that time, the meaning was much more a kind of, direct action protest, maybe some small scale insurrection. It didn't necessarily include dynamite attacks in theaters or even assassinations of...
Bruce actually explicitly stated when somebody tried to assassinate the Kaiser that this isn't propaganda by deed. He did think of it in terms of a collective, like an insurrection, like a past commune sort of idea.
Yeah, so I think the Most and others sort of added to the definition of propaganda by deed, and I think it's totally legitimate to sort of wonder, well, is this real? How far away are we getting from, from sort of an anarchism that is, which should be a constructive philosophy? But I think partly there he probably absorbed the early definition of direct action, and then I think you're right. He immensely inspired by the Russian populists, who made a science out of using dynamite, against trains and of course against the Tsar. He was thoroughly inspired by that because he met those people. There's a guy, Leo Hartman. He comes to London. It's all in London. They all sort of, talk in his ear, and I would also say the Paris Commune is really important in the sense that Most saw the retaliation. So there is the constructive part of the Commune, right? The building of a working class, essentially sort of grassroots government kind of thing. But then the way it was repressed, the brutality and the violence, that I think, so you add all these aspects, and in Most's mind, propaganda by the deed is direct action, dynamite if we need to, chemical education of chemistry. It is being ready and be prepared because the other side won't spare you, right? This is the commune and the massacre of all the communards. So he combines all of this into something that is, kind of unwholesome in a way. And in the U.S., he I think it's Haymarket. I think it's the same shock that came over European radicals when the commune was suppressed, it drowned in blood. the same shock when the death sentences were pronounced for the Haymarket defendants. There's a similarity there. It's like, oh, wow, they're not kidding around here. And this, I think it changed. Most realized this is, this is not for the United States. And then when Berkman, this is why the Frick thing is so fascinating, because it really did split. There was lots of this discussion in the anarchist movement. So I think you're right. It's hard to justify, but propaganda by the deed in the original formulation is a form of direct action, which I think is part of the anarchist kind of, but Most adds these things. And like someone mentioned earlier in his pamphlet, Free Society of 1884, there are lines in there that are appalling. I mean, it's indiscriminate violence. Yeah, we need to root them out, root and branch, just like it reads. Interestingly, if I know I'm going on, but that pamphlet, this is a nice illustration. So in 1884, he has this pamphlet, The Free Society, which has a lot of Bakuninist stuff in it. And then this other part is terrible. It's all about tactics, and we need to use everything. Arson, burn the palaces, just round them up. You have this vision of like, we're going to do to them what they did at the commune, put them against the wall, right? Then in 1887, you find out there is a new pamphlet called the same title, The Free Society. And you read it, and that whole section is gone. It's just, and some of the Bakuninist stuff is still there. It's not quite Kropotkin, right? It's not quite communist anarchism, but you read it, and it's like, wait, what? Where's the rest? Because at first I thought it was a new edition. So that's sort of an interesting way. Kind of leaves it out. I don't want this anymore. I don't believe it anymore. And it's a shorter pamphlet.
Which version is in your anthology, then?
Sorry, say that again. Which
version of the pamphlet is in your anthology?
The one you're working on.
Yeah. Is it going to be the later one or the early one?
I have the 1884 one, because I wanted to also include his violent passages.
Well, it's a problem with being historically accurate at the same time, showing that sometimes people can let their rhetoric get a little bit out of hand. Maybe they don't mean these things seriously, but they get angry and they want to vent. Shelby has his hand up. Shelby, did you want to ask?
Yeah, first, thanks for a very interesting talk. And second, you spoke about the interaction of Most with anarchists that were in London. What about his interaction with German socialist emigres in London, if any? Did he have any interactions with Marx and Engels or any of those cats? And thank you.
So the answer is yes. So when he is in London from December 1878 until December 1882. So when he just arrives in London, he's still a socialist. He's just forced into exile because there is an exception law in Germany, and he lands in London, and he is immediately asked, "Hey, I know you were an editor in Germany. Do you want to be editor of a new socialist newspaper? because everything's prohibited in Germany. We should like, and that's how Freiheit is born as a socialist newspaper. I mention all this because the founding of Freiheit becomes, and Most was not aware of this at first, becomes a huge deal. Because in Germany, socialism was suppressed, except, this is bizarre, but the exception law allowed the socialist deputies in parliament to retain their seats. So the grassroots movement is being destroyed, but you have this, what was called the faction, right, in parliament, and they are sort of like, okay, we're the only game in town, and they start criticizing Most for daring to found a new newspaper without their consent. And Most is like, dude, there's no party anymore. What are you talking about? We're continuing the struggle, right? What is this? And in that moment, he actually asks Marx and Engels, do you want to support this? And they both say, yes, this is great. Go, and I'm subscribing. I see Marx and Engels in the subscription list. So this fight becomes more and more. It's, when you're in a relationship, like there's something little like, why did you do that? And then all of a sudden all the other crap comes up. Like, I know you also did that. And so this is what happens in London. And you were never a great activist when you were still in Germany and so forth. So there's this whole thing, and they expel him from the party. And so we were talking about all this violence. This also kind of is like, you know what? You can keep your social democracy with your parliamentarism. It's not working. I'm no longer a social democrat. I'm a social revolutionary, and we're doing anything that we can to. And his whole focus is. But so yes, he had contact, not a lot though, but here and there. I would also say, if I now turn the clock back a little bit, this is in the mid 1870s when he was a social democrat. He, I guess he started reading Das Kapital, and he thought, no one's going to read this. He was a guy, he was a man, I don't want to say a simple man, but he didn't have a formal education, but he knew his audience. So he sets out to write a popular edition of Das Kapital, and he does. It's very thin. and at first Marx, I'm saying this because this is another correspondence we have. Marx is like, okay, well, that's sort of an interesting idea. Go ahead and do it. And then he does. And then Marx, the kind of pedantic kind of guy he is, he's like, oh, this is all wrong. You don't have the theory of values, not quite how you did it. And Most is like, hey, man, I'm just trying to popularize it. Here it is. Why don't you send me the corrections? And so there's that little correspondence. Yeah. But otherwise, when this whole hostility breaks out between Most and German socialists, including the ones that are in London, that it's pretty nasty. Like his first wife actually divorces him and marries a German social democrat in London. So it's like insult to injury. So,
are there any more questions or comments people would like to make while we have Tom here?
I was just surprised to read that he was such an extremist that he named one of his poor sons, it's a name for the devil.
Lucifer.
Lucifer. What a terrible thing to do.
What a moniker.
He was out there, wasn't he?
Boy
But-
named
Yeah.
Sue.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for anarchists to sort of name their children after, Marat or something, like from people from the French Revolution or something. But yeah, Lucifer is
Yeah, no, that's a bit much.
quite yeah, and he's apparent because I tracked down his, the descendants, and in all the records from 1900 to 1950, the guy is Lucifer Most. He becomes a car salesman in New Jersey. Sounds like a joke, but it's true.
Well, thank you for telling me that. I was, sorry.
Maybe I can.
I was looking him up to see if he changed his name or if it had a horrible effect on his life, but he never changed it and he became a car salesman. Okay, well, that's mystery solved. Thank you.
And I can say a few other, maybe this might be a nice way to sort of round it up. So, but his other son, his oldest son was John Jr., who became a dentist and kind of retained the radicalism of his father. He became a member of the NAACP at one point. They moved to Boston, I think, at some point. Their son, so this is Most's grandchild, was Johnny Most, who became the announcer for the Boston Celtics.
Wow.
This before my time, but I don't know if anyone knows this, but Johnny Most was like a famous announcer who died in 1993, and I'm actually in touch with his son. His name is Jamie Most.
Huh. Very cool.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
All right. We'd like to thank you, Tom, for your presentation. Everybody, I think, has enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
I'm going to end the recording here. People can stay on if they want.
Yeah.